I'm sitting in my truck in the parking lot of the county water department at 4:57 in the morning, and my hands won't stop shaking. The parking lot is empty except for cicadas in the landscaping, and my truck sitting under lights that are just starting to flicker off as dawn approaches. The humidity hangs thick enough to feel like water. The kind of August morning where breath comes heavier than it should. I've got a manila folder on my lap, the same folder I've been carrying for 4 years, and I'm about to do something that's going to change everything. Inside that building, nothing has changed. Same offices, same people, same system that's looked at my reports 3 times and decided that my concerns are somebody else's responsibility. That's what destroys me about bureaucracy. It's not cruel exactly. It's just indifferent. It can look at a problem and decide it doesn't have to be solved by them today in a way that costs anything. I've been patient. God, I hate that about myself. I've been so patient. I wrote the first report 6 months after it happened. I submitted it through every official channel. I was professional. I was methodical. I was convinced that if I just presented the data clearly enough, someone would listen. Someone would notice that the ground beneath 47 houses was literally failing. Someone would care that a 9-year-old girl had been sitting in a car that dropped 8 feet into the earth because a series of ordinary decisions by ordinary people had aggregated into catastrophe. 3 years of no response taught me something I didn't want to know about myself. I'm the kind of person who will wait forever if waiting is what it takes to avoid making people uncomfortable. But Grace is 11 now, and I've kept a photograph in my glove compartment since 2018. A girl about Grace's age, a car at the bottom of a hole. Parents who believed their driveway was safe, because everyone believes their driveway is safe. I was on the response team. I stood at the edge of that hole in the wet Ohio morning, and I understood something that changed the way I think forever. What I was looking at wasn't an accident. It was a decision. A series of small decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, catastrophic in aggregate. I've tried to fix it the right way. The official way. The way that doesn't make anybody angry or uncomfortable or forced to admit they made mistakes. That hasn't worked. So I've done something different. I've bought a house. The cheapest house on Burwood Lane. The one the real estate agent practically apologized for. The one my ex-wife laughed at when I told her we were moving. The one my daughter Grace went very quiet about when we drove past it the first time. Now as the sun comes up and turns the parking lot from gray to pale gold, I understand what it means. I've finally run out of patience. I've finally accepted that waiting is the same as choosing not to act. And I can't choose that anymore. Not for Grace. Not for the other 11-year-old girls living on streets just like Burwood Lane. The closing happened on a Tuesday in September. No fanfare. No celebration dinner. No champagne toast. I signed the last page of the purchase agreement, shook the real estate agent's hand, and walked out of the title company's office carrying a single manila folder under my arm and my daughter's hand in mine. Grace was 11. She had her mother's eyes, deep brown, and noticing everything. She had my stubbornness, which meant she hadn't said a word since we left school early for this appointment. She just walked beside me on the linoleum floor, her sneakers squeaking with each step, waiting until we reached the parking lot before she asked the question I'd been dreading. So we own it now. Her voice was small and uncertain. We own it now, I said. She looked up at me. It needs a lot of work. Yeah, like a lot of work. I know, she said. Grace was quiet for another few steps. Then she said, okay. That was it. And I understood something in that moment. That was Grace. The real kind. No drama. No complaints. Just processing. Accepting, moving forward. I'd spent 11 years being grateful for that about her. But I wasn't ready for what was coming. I wasn't ready for what that acceptance was going to cost her. They drove past the house for the first time after closing. I didn't mean to slow down, but I did. And Grace saw it immediately. She went very still in the passenger seat. The kind of still that meant she was doing calculations. That's ours, she said finally. That's ours, I said. It looks like someone quit halfway through renovations, Grace said. Pretty much. Grace unbuckled her seatbelt. I let her do it, because the moment called for it. She leaned forward. She was studying the house the way she studied everything, with the attention of someone trying to understand what they were actually looking at. The house sat at the far end of Burwood Lane, a quiet residential street in the suburb of Howard, 40 minutes outside of Columbus, Ohio. It was the kind of neighborhood that didn't look like much from the highway, but felt like a statement once you turned onto the street. Wide driveways, manicured hedges, two-car garages with clean white doors. The kind of place where people replaced their mailboxes the moment they started to lean. The house at number 17 did not fit. The driveway had a crack running through it, like a fault line. The gutters sagged. The paint on the shutters had peeled back in strips, curling like old ribbon. The roof had patches that didn't match. The previous owners, an elderly couple who'd moved to assisted living, had done their best for years. But the house had started losing the fight sometime around 2019 and surrendered completely by 2022. I bought it for $187,000. The house directly to our left, owned by a couple named the Pattersons, had sold for $340,000 18 months earlier. The house to our right, Sandra Kellner's house, had a Zillow estimate of $375,000, and Sandra made sure anyone who asked knew it. Why, Grace asked. Because it's what we can afford, I said. We have more money than that, Grace said. She was right. We did. We'd been saving carefully for almost a year. After the divorce went through, I picked up extra work. I put aside every dime I didn't absolutely need for our living expenses. We had enough for a decent house in a decent neighborhood on the other side of Columbus. The kind of place where neighbors waved from their porches. The kind where Grace wouldn't be embarrassed to invite friends over. The kind where I didn't have to explain why our house looked worse than everyone else's. This house needs someone, I said carefully. Someone who actually cares about fixing it. Grace looked at me, really looked at me, the way she'd learned to do after spending a year watching her parents' marriage unravel without either of us saying a word about it out loud. She knew when I was using an excuse instead of an explanation. That's not what you meant, she said. No, it's not. So what do you actually mean? I couldn't tell her. Not yet. Not until I was certain. Not until I understood whether I was about to save my daughter from something or put her through something for nothing. So instead, I said the thing that was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. There's something about this house that I need to understand, I said. Grace turned forward in her seat, back to studying the structure. And you think you're the only person smart enough to understand it? No. Then why aren't you explaining it to me? I felt something tighten in my chest. She was 11. She shouldn't have to be this perceptive. She shouldn't have to feel whatever I was feeling. This undercurrent of something that wasn't finished. Something that was driving me toward a decision I couldn't yet articulate. Because articulating it would make it real. It would make it seem like maybe I was crazy. Like maybe her mother was right when she said I was obsessing over something that wasn't my problem anymore. Because I don't have an explanation yet, I said. When I do, you'll be the first person I tell. You always say that, Grace said quietly. And you usually do. But sometimes the explanation takes so long I've already figured it out on my own. We drove the rest of the way in silence. I felt her eyes on me the entire drive, asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. That night, after Grace was asleep in our temporary apartment, I sat alone at the kitchen table and opened the folder for the first time in months. I'd been avoiding it. Not opening the folder meant I could pretend I wasn't obsessed. It meant I could pretend I was just a guy who'd bought a cheap house, that there wasn't another reason, that I wasn't still carrying the weight of 2018 around like a stone in my chest. The 2021 preliminary assessment was on top, my handwriting more careful then than it was now. Subsurface drainage system shows signs of differential settling. Recommend comprehensive inspection. Below that, the 2023 follow-up, marked with my notation. No response from county. Resubmitting with additional geological data. Then, the 2024 supplementary report. Sent registered mail. Marked resubmitted in red. Still no response. Beneath it, at the very bottom of the folder, the thing I kept, because I needed to remember what the work was for. The photograph. A street in a different Ohio suburb taken in the fall of 2018. The photograph showed a sinkhole. Not a large one by the standards of sinkholes. Maybe 12 feet across, 8 feet deep. But it had opened directly beneath a residential driveway at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning. And the family's car had been parked on that driveway. And the car had gone into the hole. And the family's 9-year-old daughter had been in the back seat because her mother was about to drive her to school. I looked at the photograph for a long time. I could still see the paramedics pulling the girl from the car. I could still remember her mother's face when she realized her daughter was alive. I could still feel the gratitude that something worse hadn't happened. And underneath that gratitude was something else, something like rage. The subsequent investigation found that a municipal infrastructure assessment had flagged that street's drainage system for inspection 3 years earlier. The inspection had been deferred, then deferred again, then deferred so many times that by the time someone finally decided it was worth looking at, the ground had already made its decision. That was what nobody understood. The ground always decided. The only question was whether anyone was paying attention when it did. I had decided then, standing at the edge of that hole, that I would pay attention, that I would make someone else pay attention, that I wouldn't wait for the system to work, because the system hadn't worked, and it wasn't going to work. And the only person responsible for keeping the next girl from falling was me. I closed the folder and set it aside. Tomorrow we would move into the house on Burwood Lane. Tomorrow my daughter would have to walk into school and explain to her friends why her house looked different from theirs. Tomorrow my neighbors would start wondering why a single dad had bought the worst property on the street. Tomorrow my ex-wife would call and tell me I was making a mistake. And I would let all of that happen, because something underneath all of it mattered more than any of that. Something underneath all of it had decided that I couldn't wait anymore. Moving day was a Saturday morning in October. We pulled up in a rented truck with 2 mattresses, a couch, and approximately 40 boxes, most of which were labeled Grace's stuff in my handwriting. The moving truck had barely pulled to the curb when Sandra Kellner appeared at the edge of her property. She was 61, sharp-featured, the kind of woman who wore performance fleece on weekends and still managed to look like she was heading to a board meeting. She stood at the invisible line between her lawn and the sidewalk, just observing from her side with a coffee mug in one hand and an expression that sat somewhere between concern and contempt. "Good morning," I said, setting a box down on the porch steps. Sandra tilted her head slightly. "Morning. Settling in. Doing your best." She looked at the truck, at the house, at Grace, who was carrying a box labeled art stuff, "Do not crush with both arms." Then back at me. The Hendersons, the previous owners. They were here for 32 years. Very well-regarded family. "I'm sure they were," I said. "It's a good street. We're proud of what we've built here." Sandra continued. I nodded once. I picked up another box. "I'll keep that in mind." Sandra waited as if expecting something more. An acknowledgement, a deference, some signal that I understood the implied hierarchy. When none came, she smiled tightly. "Well, welcome to Burwood." She went back inside. "She doesn't like us," Grace said from the porch. "She doesn't know us yet," I said. "Same thing for now." I looked at my daughter. "You've been spending too much time around me." Probably Grace agreed. She set her box down carefully on the floor and looked around at the empty living room. "So, what do we do now?" "We fix it," I said. "Fix it how?" "Everything. The gutters, the shutters, the driveway." I paused. The kitchen floor squeaks in the northeast corner. "I know. I've been stepping over it since we got here the first time." "We'll fix that too," I said. Grace nodded like she believed me. Then she picked up her box again. "Which room is mine?" "Top of the stairs on the left. The one with the big window." Grace headed upstairs, and I stood in the empty living room listening to her footsteps echo off the hardwood floor. I thought about the photograph in my folder. I thought about the girl at the bottom of the hole, and I thought about my own daughter, walking up creaking stairs in a house that nobody else wanted, trusting me completely, even though I was carrying a secret that was going to change everything. Within 48 hours, the whispers had started. I could feel them the way you feel weather changing before you see it. The slight pause in conversation when I walked to the mailbox. The neighbor across the street, a man named Doug Patterson, who waved but looked away too quickly. The way Sandra Kellner had parked her car at an angle that gave her a perfect sightline to my driveway from her kitchen window. I knew what they were saying. I'd grown up around men who said it. Guys in over his head, bought the worst house on the block. That's a red flag. You don't pay that little for a house unless something's wrong with it. Which was true. Of course there was something wrong with it. That was precisely why I bought it. But I didn't explain that to anyone. Not yet. I sent Grace to school, and she came home with reports. Kids asking why her house looked different. Teachers being kind in that particular way that signaled they knew something was wrong. Grace was marked, and she knew it. I experienced the neighborhood's judgment firsthand. Sandra Kellner stopped by ostensibly to welcome us, but really to inquire about our renovation plans. The Pattersons waved but maintained distance. At the grocery store, I ran into someone from my work who mentioned seeing me moving into that house on Burwood Lane. The phrasing made clear what was implied. That's the worst house on the street. I began my reconnaissance. I walked the neighborhood during off hours. I took measurements. I photographed subtle elevation changes in the ground. I studied the street with the intensity of someone who knows exactly what he's looking for. Grace noticed. She came home from school to find me examining soil samples under a magnifying glass. She asked directly, "What are you doing?" "Checking something," I said. At 6 in the morning, best time. I stood and picked up the spade. Grace leaned against the doorframe, watching me. "You've been looking at this spot since we toured the house." I didn't answer right away. I stood, picked up the spade, and pushed it into the soil with my boot. "I'll explain later." "You always say that." "And I always explain eventually." She made a face, the exact face her mother used to make, and went back inside to finish breakfast. By 6 a.m. on day 3, I was in the backyard before dawn. The humidity was already oppressive. I put on my work gloves and went outside with a long-handled spade. I started at the back corner of the property, near the old oak tree, where the ground was slightly depressed. A subtle bowl shape in the lawn that most people wouldn't notice, unless they knew to look for it. I crouched down and pressed my palm flat against the grass. Held it there for a moment like I was trying to feel something underneath. Grace appeared in the doorway behind me, backpack on, spoon still in her hand. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Checking something." At 6 in the morning, best time. Grace leaned against the doorframe, watching me. "You've been looking at this spot since we toured the house." I didn't answer right away. I stood, picked up the spade, and pushed it into the soil with my boot. "I'll explain later." "You always say that, and I always explain eventually." She made a face, the exact face her mother used to make, and went back inside to finish breakfast. By 7:30, I'd dug a trench about 14 inches deep along the back fence line. I wasn't working randomly. Every placement of the spade was deliberate, measured, guided by something invisible to anyone watching from the outside. By 9, Doug Patterson came out to get his newspaper. He was about 64, had the bearing of a man who had opinions and wasn't ashamed of having them. He stopped at the end of his driveway, just staring at the growing trench for a long moment. "What are you putting in?" Doug called over. I looked up. "Not putting in. Taking out." "Taking out what?" "Not sure yet." Doug squinted. "You're digging before you know what you're digging for." "I know what I'm looking for," I said. "I just don't know exactly where it is yet." Doug stared at me for another beat, then picked up his newspaper and went inside. Through the window, I saw him say something to his wife, Linda. By noon, the digging had become visible from the street. By 2, people were slowing their cars as they passed. By 4, Sandra Kellner appeared, and she didn't ring the bell this time. She walked straight up the driveway with the practiced confidence of someone who believed property lines were suggestions. She stopped at the edge of the grass with her hands crossed over her chest. "There are ordinances," she said as her opening. I stopped digging. I looked at her. I waited. Howard has codes about excavation. You need a permit for any digging deeper than 18 inches, and you need to notify the HOA before making exterior changes. She paused, This qualifies. I'm aware of the codes, I said. Are you? 18-inch limit. I'm at 14. I held her gaze. I've read the HOA bylaws. All 42 pages. Sandra's mouth tightened. That still doesn't give you the right to just destroy your property. Actually, it does, I said quietly. My property. My decision. I turned back to my digging before she could respond. I heard her sharp intake of breath. Heard her turn and walk back toward her own house. Heard her muttering something under her breath that might have been about permits or lawyers or both. But I didn't stop digging. I kept my spade in the ground and my attention on the pattern of the soil and the way the earth was beginning to reveal what was underneath. That night, after Grace was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with the county code on my laptop. I'd been prepared for this conversation with Sandra. I'd read everything. I knew exactly what I could and couldn't do, and I knew that what I was doing was technically legal. But legal and wise were different things. Legal and smart were different things. And I was beginning to understand that doing the right thing often meant doing something that looked completely crazy to everyone watching from the outside. I thought about calling my ex-wife. I knew what she would say. She would say I was obsessing, that I needed to let go of the 2018 thing, that I was putting Grace through something she didn't deserve, that I was making decisions based on a trauma that wasn't even our trauma. Maybe she was right, but I'd tried the right way. I'd tried the official way. I'd tried being patient and professional and convincing, and nothing had worked. So what was left except this? Except to go crazy enough that someone had to pay attention. By day 5 of digging, the trench ran almost 20 feet along the fence line. By day 6, I'd found the first clear sign. A place where the soil was softer than it should have been, where water was moving, where it shouldn't. My hands were blistered. My back ached. I'd lost 5 pounds I didn't have to lose. But I was also absolutely certain I was right. That night, Grace found me in the kitchen staring at soil samples under a magnifying glass. She didn't ask questions anymore. She simply stated, "You're going to find it." I looked at my daughter. She was still in her school clothes. Her backpack was at her feet, and she was looking at her father with a clarity that broke something inside me. "How do you know?" I asked. "Because you have your 'this matters more than anything' face. The face you had when Mom was leaving. The face you had after the thing that happened 4 years ago that you never talk about." I felt time stop. My 11-year-old daughter just called out the thing I'd been hiding. She'd seen through the pretense. She'd understood that something from my past was driving my present. "Grace," I started, but she interrupted. "I don't need you to explain," she said. "But I need you to know that I see it. And I'm scared. Not of the digging. Of what happens when you find what you're looking for." I sat down. For the first time in 4 years, I considered telling her everything. About 2018. About the girl. About the photograph. About why I bought this house. Why I'm digging. Why our life has been disrupted. But Grace spoke first. "Is someone going to be safer because of what you're doing?" "I think so," I said. "Then I'm ready for whatever happens next." Grace put her hand on my shoulder, a gesture so rare and so profound that I had to look away to maintain composure. She went upstairs to do homework. I sat alone in the kitchen with soil samples and the understanding that my daughter was braver than I was, that she understood something about sacrifice that I was still learning myself. That night, the county letter arrived. Official letterhead. Official signature. The inspection is approved. The county geotechnical team will arrive on Monday morning. I held the letter with shaking hands. 4 years. 3 reports. 1 desperate house purchase. And finally, it's happening. I don't feel vindication. I feel terror. Because being right means 47 families are living on compromised ground. Being right means what happened to one girl could happen to another. Being right means I'm about to blow up the neighborhood's sense of safety, and I'm going to be blamed for it. At 3 a.m., I can't sleep. I go to my truck and pull out the photograph. The sinkhole from 2018. The car. The girl. And I let myself feel what I've been running from. The weight of knowing something terrible and being unable to stop it. The rage of watching bureaucracy fail. The grief of understanding that most people care more about comfort than safety. Grace appears at my truck window in her pajamas. She climbs into the passenger seat and sits with me in silence, looking at the photograph. She doesn't ask what it is. She already knows. "Are you scared?" she asks. "Yeah." "Of what?" "Of being right. Of what it means. Of what happens next." Grace nods slowly. "We have to see it through, though." "Yeah." And then my 11-year-old daughter leans her head on my shoulder, and we sit together in the dark, waiting for Monday morning, 8 a.m. The county geotechnical team arrives with equipment and serious expressions. They begin drilling. They begin testing. They begin confirming everything I've said. The morning is quiet. The afternoon is electric with unspoken tension. By late afternoon, the team foreman calls me over. The test results are in. The subsurface drainage system is failing. Sinkholes are a realistic possibility within the next 5 to 10 years. Everything you said is true. I stand there listening to these words that I've been waiting to hear for 4 years. Everything I said was true. And instead of feeling vindication, I feel terror. Because being right means everything changes. Being right means the comfortable life my neighbors have been living is built on compromised ground. Being right means I'm the person who forced them to confront something they'd preferred to ignore. Word spreads quickly through the neighborhood. By Tuesday, emergency neighborhood meetings are scheduled. By Wednesday, city council is involved. By Thursday, news crews are setting up. And the narrative in the neighborhood shifts from poor single dad to crazy guy who knew something. But that shift doesn't come with gratitude. It comes with blame. Because I'm the person who revealed that their safe neighborhood isn't safe. I'm the person who forced the system to acknowledge a problem it had been ignoring. I'm the person who made them confront something they'd preferred not to know. Sandra Kellner's demeanor completely changes. She stops seeing me as someone bringing down the street and starts seeing me as someone who might have saved it. She comes to my door with an apology that's almost mournful. Apology for having judged, for having been small, for having cared more about property values than actual safety. She brings homemade pasta and a list of contacts. City councilmen, reporters, engineers. Doug Mitchell comes over with beers one evening, and we stand in the backyard together. Doug is also a former engineer, and he understands what I've done. He tells me something personal. I spent 40 years in the Navy and 30 years in a job that asked nothing difficult of me. I forgot what it looked like to watch someone do something that actually mattered, something that cost them something. He pauses. "I'm glad you moved in. I want to make sure I said that directly, not just implied it." "I heard you," I said. And then, because Doug had been honest enough to deserve honesty back, "I'm glad you were the first one who actually asked what I was doing. Even if you were skeptical." "I'm still a little skeptical," Doug said. "By nature." "That's a feature, not a flaw," I said. Doug almost smiled. A real one this time. The kind that reached all the way up. He raised his beer briefly, and I raised mine, and we stood together in the quiet backyard of number 17 Burwood Lane. 2 men on either side of 60, drinking beer in the dark over the repaired ground, acknowledging something without needing to say what. My ex-wife Jennifer calls. She's no longer angry. She's ashamed that she laughed at me. She wants to understand. She wants to be part of this now. But I gently decline. This was my responsibility to carry. It's not hers to claim now that it's vindicated. The climax isn't a triumph. It's a recognition. The neighborhood learns what I know. That safety isn't given. It's fought for. That sometimes the person doing the hardest work will be blamed for the inconvenience of the truth. That being right doesn't make you popular. It makes you necessary. But more importantly, Grace learns something. She learns that her father is the kind of person who will do something costly and uncomfortable because it's right. She learns that love isn't always easy, and the people worth loving are the ones who will do hard things for people they'll never meet. In the weeks after the inspection, life on Burwood Lane normalizes into a different kind of normal. The street undergoes infrastructure assessment. Engineers come and go. Repair plans are drawn up. It will be expensive, disruptive, inconvenient. but it will also be necessary. And there's a subtle shift in how people interact with me. Sandra brings over homemade pasta and an apology that's almost mournful. The Pattersons invite Grace and me to dinner. Doug Mitchell becomes a regular presence, sharing beers in the backyard and stories about the Navy. Grace's school experience shifts. Kids who were keeping distance suddenly want to be friends with the girl whose dad figured out the street was breaking. She's marked differently now, not as the weird kid in the bad house, but as the kid whose dad did something important. But I'm different. I'm quieter. The achievement that should feel like vindication feels like burden. I'm still the person who carried knowledge for 4 years. I'm still the person who had to do something desperate to force the system to listen. I'm still the person who looked at a photograph of a 9-year-old girl and decided to reshape my life around that moment. One evening, Grace and I sit in the backyard. The trench has been filled. The yard is beginning to recover. The oak tree stands in the last light of day, solid and patient. Grace says something I wasn't expecting. You know what the tree reminds me of? What? You. The way it just stands there while everything around it is happening. It doesn't do anything dramatic. It just keeps its roots in the ground and holds its position and waits. I think about that. The roots do the real work. The part above the ground is just the result. And I realize that Grace has understood from the beginning what I was doing. Not the technical details, not the infrastructure failure, but the principle that holding your ground matters, even when everyone around you is moving. That night, I sit at the kitchen table late and look at the photograph one more time. The girl at the bottom of the hole, the moment that changed everything. And I realize that I've made peace with it, not because the girl was saved. She had already been saved, but because I prevented someone else from being put in that position. Because somewhere on a street I'll never visit, a parent will never have to experience what that girl's mother experienced. Because I bought a house and dug a trench and forced the system to listen. 6 months after the inspection results were confirmed, the house on Burwood Lane looks different. Not fancy. I'm not wealthy, but intentional. The driveway has been patched. The gutters have been replaced. The paint on the shutters has been refreshed. The kitchen floor no longer squeaks. I've done the work myself, slowly. Weekends when Grace isn't asking me to do something with her. And she does ask me to do things now. Her friends come over. They laugh in the backyard. They play games. The house that once seemed like a liability has become something else. A home, not because it's beautiful, but because it's ours. And we've made it ours deliberately. Grace is thriving in school. She's made friends. She's in the advanced program. She's started a nature club. She draws pictures of the oak tree in the backyard. And her art teacher has started talking about her potential. She's no longer the girl with the weird house. She's Grace, who draws beautifully, who understands things, whose father did something important. On a Saturday afternoon, Grace and I sit in the backyard, and she asks me finally to tell her the whole story. Not the version she's been constructing from fragments, the whole story. So I tell her about 2018, about the girl, about the photograph, about why I bought this house, about the 4 years of waiting, about the moment I decided I couldn't wait anymore. Grace listens without interrupting. When I'm done, she says, "You were right to do it." Was I ask? Or did I just do what I had to do? Same thing Grace says. And I realize that my daughter has understood from the beginning that doing what you have to do is the same as doing what's right. She doesn't need me to justify my choices. She just needed me to see them through. On a cool evening with the sun setting and the street quiet, Doug Mitchell comes over one last time. He brings 2 beers and sits with me in the backyard. We don't need to talk much, but Doug says something that matters. When Linda heard the inspection results, she cried. Not because of the problem, because of the solution. Because you cared enough to see it through. Because someone was paying attention. I listen. I've heard variations of gratitude from many people, but something about Doug's version lands differently. Doug understands what it means to witness someone doing something difficult. Doug has been changed by watching. Later that week, I receive an official letter from the county. They want to hire me as a consultant. They want my expertise. They want me to help develop the protocols for how the county should have responded in the first place. I consider it, but I tell them no, not because I don't want to, but because I've realized something. I bought this house for a reason, and that reason was connected to a moment 4 years ago. But that reason also has an expiration date. The moment has been processed. The street is being fixed. A wrong is being made right. Now I want to simply be a father. I want to watch my daughter grow up in a house that doesn't carry the weight of my obsession. I want to have a normal Tuesday, a normal job, a normal life, where I'm not the guy who figured something out and changed everything. I'm content to be the person who did what was necessary, and then stepped back and let the system work. I meet with Jennifer, my ex-wife, one final time. She tells me she's proud of me, and something shifts in me. The defensiveness I've carried, the need to prove myself, the bitterness about my marriage ending. It softens. My ex-wife is proud of me. My daughter is proud of me. Doug is proud of me. The neighborhood is proud of me, or at least most of it. That's enough. Grace asks me one night, "Are you sad about going back to normal work?" I think about it. "No," I say. "Normal sounds good right now." And Grace nods, understanding that her father has carried something, and now he's putting it down. She's honored to have been part of that journey, but she's also relieved that she doesn't have to carry it anymore. The final image. I'm sitting in the backyard with my daughter, the oak tree in the distance, the yard that I dug up and that has healed, the house that nobody wanted that I bought deliberately, the life that seemed like a catastrophe that has become simply a life, a good life, an ordinary life, the kind of life you get to live when you've done something difficult and then learned to live normally again. And I think about value, about what determines the worth of a thing. The neighborhood valued the house at $187,000. That price was based on market demand, on comparable properties, on what people were willing to pay. The neighborhood valued the houses around it at $300,000, $375,000, because they were clean, functional, desirable. But value has nothing to do with what someone else is willing to pay for something. Value has everything to do with what someone is willing to do with something. The house on Burwood Lane was worthless in the marketplace, but in my hands, it became priceless. Not because I fixed it, but because I understood that the house wasn't the point. The street was the point. The safety of the people living on it was the point. And that's what nobody else understood. They saw the cheap house and made assumptions. They assumed I was struggling. They assumed I was desperate. They assumed my presence meant something was wrong. But what was wrong was that the system had failed, and the system's failure was being masked by the neighborhood's insistence on not seeing it. I realized something else too. The girl from the photograph will never know my name. She'll never know that a man in a different suburb bought a house and dug a trench because he saw her car at the bottom of a hole. She'll never know that her moment of terror contributed to the safety of dozens of other families. She'll simply grow up, and maybe someday she'll live on a street where she doesn't have to worry about sinkholes. She'll have that safety because of something I did, and she'll never know it. That's okay. I'm not doing this for recognition. I'm not doing it to be a hero or to be celebrated. I'm doing it because the alternative was unacceptable to me. Knowing something was wrong and doing nothing. The weight of knowledge had become too heavy to carry alone, because somewhere inside me lives the conviction that people matter more than comfort, that safety matters more than the pretense of safety. And that conviction came from a moment 4 years ago, when I stood at the edge of a hole and understood, with complete clarity, that the world doesn't owe anyone safety. You have to build it. You have to fight for it. You have to do uncomfortable things so that other people can live in comfort. I look out at my street, my neighborhood, the place that judged me and then came to respect me and then slowly moved on. Because that's what people do. They judge, then they adjust, then they forget. Because human beings are remarkable at both being kind and being forgetful. But I won't forget. Grace won't forget. We'll carry this with us. It will shape how we understand our responsibility to the world. It will shape what we believe matters. And when I look at the house I bought, the cheapest house on the street, the one nobody wanted, I understand that it was never really about the house. It was about what the house let me do. It was about what the house let me become. It was about my daughter watching her father do something difficult and learning that doing difficult things is sometimes what love looks like. Because the value of a thing has never once in the entire history of the world been determined by what somebody else was willing to pay for it. It has always been determined by what someone was willing to do with it. And I was willing to do everything. To give up comfort. To endure judgment. To make my daughter walk into a school where kids whispered about her house. To stand at the edge of a hole in the ground 4 years ago and carry the weight of that moment forward, even when everyone told me to let it go. That was the real value. Not what others recognized, but what I was willing to do in the dark. Alone. When nobody was watching and nobody would ever know. That was everything.